Thanks for joining me. I know it's late in the week at reInvent, and I'm sure you're all pretty tired, but thanks for coming out. I'm Zach Beers. I'm doing this illusion of efficiency talk, but before we get into me, I have a whole slide on it. We'll talk about quick agenda. So what we're going to do first is give you all a little bit of context. Who am I? Who's DoiT? Why are we talking about this? And then we'll get into the real meat and potatoes of the session. We'll talk about illusion of efficiency and where some pitfalls happen, challenges that people run into, some potential solutions, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about some customer stories, specifically from DoiT and how they've fallen into some of these traps and how we've helped them. Then we'll leave a little bit of time, depending on how well I do, for questions at the end if anybody has them. So quick on me. I've been in this industry for 10 plus years now, either building solutions on AWS, other clouds, whether they be scalable solutions, cost-efficient solutions, et cetera. Been doing the FinOps area for maybe about 7-8 years or so. So most of that, my tenure at DoiT, because we spend a lot of time working with customers on cost efficiency. Previously, before I lead a global solutions engineering team, but I ran a technical account management team at DoiT for about 4 or 5 years. So we were helping customers on a day in, day out basis with these types of topics. On a side note, I'm a family man, 3 kids, I have a wife, probably not too dissimilar from a lot of you out there, so I'm just a normal guy. Really quick, again, a couple minutes on DoiT, just to give you all some context about who we are, because you may not have ever heard of us before. We look to deliver the true promise of the cloud. That's our general mission. We're a premier AWS Partner, MSP. We're doing a lot of good things in the ecosystem. We have over 2,400 customers on AWS alone. We do also do multi-cloud, but today I'm going to be focusing only on AWS. And where some of the uniqueness of how we deliver value to our customers is how we operate, which is maybe a little bit different than some other companies out there. We have our own technology. We like to call it like operational or operating and workload intelligence. And then we also have a staff of engineers, probably 200, 300 globally. And we call that our human intelligence, right? And that's how we drive value to customers through data, technology, and our staff of engineers who are really have a lot of expertise in the cloud, right? But it's really when you start to combine some of these things with like the well-architected framework as an example, or other different models that AWS and cloud vendors use, that's where we're really starting to get sticky with customers. Last thing I'd say here is we've got a number of different competencies. These are like typically kind of our areas of specialty on infrastructure and data, and this is how we generally segment them out. But just some quick context for you all, because you may not have heard of us before. So what is the illusion of efficiency? Because it may not be a concept that anyone is really all that familiar with, right? And we're going to start with what businesses are really doing today and some of the challenges that they're running into. And this is going to be somewhat of a provocative section of this talk, but this is based on like real things that we're seeing in the market, which are businesses are taking a very fragmented approach to how they want to drive cloud optimization within their business, right? They have many different departments, many different priorities, different goals. There are different business units who have their own objectives, and those priorities aren't always aligned, right? Sometimes someone's going to go do something that another department may not even be remotely aware of, right? There's also the leadership aspect too, right? They're potentially just pushing things down for middle management or individual contributors to, go deliver on some cost savings, whether it be 5-10% of their costs, whatever it might be. And part of the reason for that is there are a lot of different external pressures, right? There's market pressure. profitability pressure, competition, products are always changing. This industry probably changes every hour, right? So, well, we can probably hold leadership and everyone accountable for, maybe doing things in an inefficient way. It's still challenging, right? Like these external forces are really hard, which this ends up leading to a vicious cycle, right? Save me money, low effort cost optimization, low effort cloud optimization, get me to my goal. But there may not be a lot of context. That might not even be possible. And to be fair, there are some companies who are doing a good job of this, right? They're well-staffed, they have a lot of expertise, but many don't have that, right? They have very small teams, and doing something like optimization could be somebody's secondary job. It's not even their primary objective. So just to give you all a couple of quick examples, if you're not super familiar with the space, but there are some really tactical things that you can do when it comes to optimization, like getting rid of unused disk or buying reserved instances or getting rid of IP addresses, shutting down NAT gateways that aren't being used, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're going to talk about today is how you really need to dig a little bit deeper in order to solve some of these challenges. But again, the first challenge is really the business themselves and probably people in general, right? And the way you can kind of think about this in general is you don't know what you don't know. And there's always going to be a small portion of information that you have that you do know, and the rest of it is kind of a mystery to you. So that's why I put this slide in here with the iceberg, because there's a lot of things that are a bit unknown to organizations that really they need to go uncover if they're going to do this effectively. So we're going to pivot to kind of the next challenge that a lot of companies run into. And this is actually based on costs and cloud management tools today. So think of there's a lot of third-party tools out there. There's Cost Explorer on AWS. And these are all really useful tools, right? You need to be able to get data to understand where to go and how to figure out where to optimize. But it actually ends up being a challenge in some way, shape, or form because customers actually almost treat that as their only option for optimizing, right? So I've seen so many customers come to DoiT who are, they see some recommendation in the API or whatever or in the UI that says, hey, we can buy our eyes and save X amount of dollars, right? Where many of us probably know it's a little bit more effective to actually think about, well, what's the risk of that and things like that, right? So oftentimes what the data does is it lacks business context, right? And this is kind of part of some of the FinOps culture that some of you may be aware of, where you need to start sharing things across the business and people need to collaborate on what are business objectives, technical objectives, et cetera, right? But it can take you down a rabbit hole that leads you down a path of not saving anything at all, right? We had an example of a customer who came to us using some third-party tools, and they were like, we can save thousands if we do X, Y, and Z. Come help us implement it, right? And we went down that path probably, I don't remember how long the engagement took, but probably a couple hours, only for us to save the customer a fraction of that cost, right? So if you treat the data too much like it's the only thing that's in your repertoire, you're going to run into challenges, right? And even general reporting itself can be misleading. Let's say there's a spike, right, in your costs, and you have some reports that you're always looking at, maybe they're scheduled, et cetera. And then you go investigate that. But then when you talk to somebody on the technical side, they say, oh, well, that's expected, right? We were running some queries on Redshift, or we're doing some testing on our databases in Aurora or RDS, et cetera, right? So to give you another kind of more tangible example is things like resource utilization is very common in the industry, right? Let me go right-size my machines. And the basic concept here for anyone who isn't aware of this concept is I might have a set of machines in a fleet or standalone, whatever they are, and they're only being used at 30% capacity. And what I do is I right-size those down to a smaller machine so it's better fit for the workload, right? But we have a general concept at DoiT called utilized waste, where sure, maybe you're actually you're fully utilized in capacity on the instance type itself, but maybe your architecture isn't really form-fitted for what you're actually trying to do in the workload, right? Maybe you need to move to a managed service, maybe you need to move to Kubernetes, who knows? And that's not to say that doing right sizing or any of these things I've talked about aren't useful, because they are. They do save money. But I think what we're doing at DoiT is we're saying there's usually a little bit more than just that. So the ultimate thing you can kind of take away from this portion is data should be used as a compass, right? These tools should be used as a compass to kind of guide you in the right direction, to ask the right questions, not as a doctrine for optimization. So the next one is, in my opinion, probably the biggest one of all that companies run into is the challenge of the technology, the cloud itself, right? This is absolutely one of the biggest aspects that leads to utilized waste, and I'll give a couple examples later. But it's just not often well understood across the organization why certain services or certain technologies are used, if they're being utilized well, et cetera. This is going to be a common theme, right? Sharing context across your business is going to be a really important factor to making sure you're avoiding some of these pitfalls. But again, it's not always about choosing the right service. Sometimes it's about tactical implementation of those services. Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the staff to be able to do that appropriately? The list goes on and on. So designing and implementing well set up architectures is key to avoiding this illusion of efficiency. So I've done a lot of talking about challenges, but we haven't actually really talked about what this is, right? So the way I would define this for everyone is the illusion of efficiency is the belief, right, throughout an organization, it's not just one person, that you're running a well-optimized estate. But in reality, you're probably not, for all the things that I just mentioned. Lack of data, lack of context, whatever it might be. Another way to think about it would be is you're treating symptoms rather than treating underlying diseases, is probably a good analogy for this, right? Again, the belief is fostering everything that I mentioned. And again, it's hard because of all these different pressures that are kind of coming into the organization. So how do we actually go and solve this challenge? And the reality is that for complex problems like this, just like any other complex problem, the solutions are kind of nuanced, right? You have to do a lot of different things well in order to avoid this, and you have to do it very consistently. But again, we'll have some customer cases where we can talk about where they're either doing it well or they're doing it not. So first and foremost, the tooling that I talked about that's actually causing a challenge, you do need it, right? It's absolutely essential, just like we talked about. You need that data to kind of drive you in the right direction. You need a financially conscious org, right? One that's willing to work together and share the context about what they're trying to accomplish and make sure everyone's on the same page, right? And typically speaking, that's driving towards business needs. There's also technical needs as well. But staying aligned as an organization, as many of you probably know, isn't that simple. But you need to be really disciplined there. And lastly, like I said, you need to have a really strong set of technical strategies, the right architecture, and that changes all the time, right? One architecture when you first started, 5, 6 years later, is probably not the right one at that point, given how fast the industry changes, right? But again, you need to continue to stay aligned to business goals. And actually, let me go back really quick for a second, because there's one other thing I hadn't talked about yet, which is the idea of innovation. A lot of people talk about this concept, let's innovate, build new stuff. Really, all that word means is change. So all you have to do is be open to the idea, of doing something differently. And if you're able to do that, some of those other things that I just mentioned will start to trickle down. You'll have some success. So let me give one more kind of concrete example of when you can run into challenges in this kind of illusion of efficiency. And this is with caches, content delivery networks, right? This is designed to improve performance, right, and cut costs at the same time. If you have global users, you want to serve content closer to them, cache is a perfect use case for that. Very simple, right? That way, it doesn't hit the origin server, you're not getting charged for networking costs, etc., right? But issues can arise when the cache is filled with objects but are not frequently being accessed, right? So you're utilizing the infrastructure, or you're leveraging the infrastructure, but you're not utilizing it, right? So again, this leads to the opposite effect of what you want to accomplish, right? Which is higher costs, worse performance, and your customers are probably suffering. And there are some simple ways, even though they're not that simple to implement, as some of you may know. But there are ways to avoid this pitfall, right? You can improve your cache hit ratio with expiration times, right? You can use cache control headers, or you can prioritize static content for your cache and your CDN. But again, just one more kind of general example of where you can kind of run into some challenges with this. So now that I've kind of set the stage for what is the illusion of efficiency and the pitfalls you run into and things you can do to avoid it, I'm going to talk about some specific customer stories that we've seen it do it. There's about 6 of them, and we're going to run through a number of different examples that cover DynamoDB to Elasticache to networking costs, etc. So our first customer, they're an advertising company based out of the United States, and they have a really strong technical team on the Kubernetes side. They actually came to us and said, like, we feel really strongly about our capabilities there, which I'm sure everyone believed, right? And they believed that there was potential efficiencies to be found in their environment, but they just weren't totally sure how to find them. They were using native tools when it comes to cost management, and they just have a really small technical team. So I mentioned this earlier, but this is where that's kind of a shared responsibility across their team, and they often prioritize something other than cost savings, right? So when we onboarded them, we have again our own software, our own tool to look into the data where we can find areas that we could tackle, right? And the first place that we decided to go, which was pretty egregious, was their egress costs, right? And this, in particular, data transfer at the regional and actually at the AZ level, but the screenshot here on the slide only shows regional data transfer just for the purposes of everyone's eyes. So what we did was, after we used some data to kind of directionally go in the right direction, we brought in a Kubernetes expert from the DoiT team as well as a networking expert. Happened to be one person, but sometimes it can be 2. And we did just one 1-hour session where we looked at their architecture, we looked into their environment. We typically only do read-only access. And what we found was the customer was actually leveraging EKS topology aware only on external services and not internal services. So when it came to routing traffic, this is what was causing all of it to go in many different directions and places, whether it be across availability zones or across regions. So what we did is we helped them set up EKS topology aware on internal services. So that way routing can go into intelligent places based on the application. But we also help them set up and use a more efficient protocol like gRPC, as well as set up some private endpoints for them. So that way traffic isn't hitting the public internet, which can obviously increase cost. So based on the screenshot, based on the chart, what you can see is once we implemented all of this, their spend dipped dramatically, right? Literally the day after, pretty much. And what we projected, and I think it was about $200K a month in savings. This isn't a Fortune 500 type company, but that was really significant for them, potentially kind of business changing even in that given year and going forward. And again, we projected about 1.8 annually that they were going to save just from maybe a couple hours worth of work, right? And again, we used in combination all these things that I've talked about, tools, data, really kind of dug into places where we felt like they can make some tactical changes in their architecture. Again, significant savings for the customer. They felt like they had a solid setup, but it turned out there was probably more there than met the eye than what the customer actually believed, right? So next we have a digital media publisher based out of the United Kingdom. And this customer in particular was leveraging third-party cost management tools for visibility. So they had some kind of standard practice internally to be able to discover these things and try and optimize for costs, right? So a little bit different than the last one. But this is just another case where we saw high networking costs when we really started to look into the data. Some of you probably know this, but it can be quite challenging to figure out where, excuse me, networking costs are coming from, what's driving them, et cetera, right? So we used our tool to get to SKU, tag, resource level metadata within the AWS Cur file. And we discovered particular NAT gateways that the customer was leveraging that was causing a lot of traffic to go out to the internet, right? And there's a number of different ways you're going to get charged for this. But again, think of this like directional data. Now we have an idea about where we need to go, right? So from here, what our engineers, once they got looped in, decided to do was actually temporarily enable VPC flow logs, right? VPC flow logs can be very expensive if you leave them on for too long. So we ran them for maybe an hour or two to make sure that we weren't driving up costs, just to do some analysis. And the reason we did this is because we wanted to track IP traffic, right? Whether it be east-west traffic between internal instances internally, or call it north-south traffic to the public internet and back, right? And what we found by correlating some of this data is that, excuse me, there was a particular proxy service that was running on EKS that was downloading terabytes of data every 12 hours from the public internet, right? So again, in a combination of all these different things, this is how we kind of came to this particular service that was doing this, right? So the NAT gateways technically were the problem, but the underlying symptoms, the underlying challenge was actually this service in particular, right? So just a last bit of context on this is the app had no reason to go to the public internet, right? It was downloading or getting data from S3, and as many of us probably know, there are public and private endpoints for S3, right? So what we did was we kind of mapped out what a potential solution would look like. We helped the customer go implement it, so that way we were leveraging things like VPC endpoints or S3 endpoints, excuse me, to keep all the traffic internal. We didn't want traffic going external anymore, and we helped the customer set up appropriate route tables so that way all the traffic needed to go where it needed to be. And as a kind of secondary part of this, what we did for this customer is we built some Terraform code for them so that way they could deploy it in a more automated fashion rather than just going in and manually doing it, right? So what the customer did was, because we actually don't go into their environment and go deploy these things ourselves, we handed it over to the customer. They made some tweaks for their environment. They went to test and dev to make sure it was running appropriately, threw it into staging, and put it into production, right? So after all this, the customer is able to save about $3K a month. That doesn't sound like a lot, but for context, that's about 11% of their spend, which is relatively significant, right? And the customer is really happy about the outcome, and they got to some of the goals that they wanted to achieve. But the reality was they just really didn't know that this was happening, right? And it was a really granular aspect of the technology stack that they were using that we had to go find to go solve their problem for them. So this next customer we have, supply chain management company based out of EMEA. And the customer originally came to us wanting to upgrade their Aurora databases. In this particular case is a MySQL database. And the database was a production database, so we had to be relatively careful about what we were doing. And this particular database had over 20 billion rows, so 20 billion records potentially of data. And we needed to move them from 5.7 to 8.0. And some of the other customer requirements here were they were prioritizing minimal downtime, right? It's a production database. And the size of the database really kind of increased the complexity of this upgrade, right? So what the DoiT engineer decided to do was take a bit more of a holistic approach, right? Sat down with the customer for probably 2 or 3 different sessions to talk about what they were doing, what was going on in their environment, making sure that he had all these different details so he could recommend the right approach and go implement the right approach. So through some of these exercises, whether it be like, again, getting access to their environment or talking to them about their architecture, getting the right documentation, he found that they were using RDS proxy. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what's the relevance of RDS proxy, right? Like you can use it for things like improving performance on your database, but the customer actually had plans to do a blue-green deployment. And in this particular case, RDS proxy is not supported by blue-green deployments. So the customer had to go and take a different strategy, right? It's not compatible. So what our engineer recommended was a simulated upgrade, right? Clone the existing cluster and do an in-place upgrade. And what this allowed for was it offered a rollback plan in case anything went wrong, and it allowed for minimal downtime. So just about every requirement the customer had, right? And now you all are probably wondering, where are we going with this, right? It's just a probably simple, if not somewhat complex upgrade, database upgrade for a customer. So the upgrade went smoothly, and the customer got the outcome that they were looking for. But through this process, the DoiT engineer found additional topics that they could discuss, and in this case, it happened to be on cost optimization or cloud optimization. The customer was totally unaware of, right? They came to us wanting to do a database upgrade. They had no idea that there was some aspect of their Aurora databases that could be optimized, right? So the opportunity here was to save, on high Aurora I/O usage. The DoiT engineer used, again, our tooling as well as access to their environment to understand the level of I/O usage, and you can actually kind of see some of it on the chart. At least of it's, most of it is actually just spend information. So what we recommended was for certain workloads, for certain Aurora database clusters, this is all their spend related to Aurora, to move to Aurora I/O optimized. Because again, some of their workloads just was a better fit for it based on the use case. And the customer ended up saving about, I think the slide says 4.5K a month, which again, in context, because that doesn't sound like a ton, was about 5% of their bill. So in this given example, right, customer came to us to do something completely different, right? Upgrade our database. And what they got was that plus something they had no idea what was happening, and we managed to save them some money along the way. So we have 3 more customer stories to go through, but hopefully you all can start to see where customers can run into problems and where they can fall into this illusion of efficiency, right? So next, this is actually probably one of my favorite examples, and it's a long one, so please bear with me. So in this case, we had a semiconductor manufacturing company based out of the US. And this one's a little bit different than the last few that I've talked about, as well as the next 2. And the customer came to us with a challenge around WebSockets and API gateway. And we initially kind of engaged with the customer. They're being a little bit difficult to work with, but we'll give them some credit because, if apps are being down, then I can understand that, right? So we tried to solve some of their challenges, but given like where they were at and what was going on with their application, they just said, hey, we think there's a problem with AWS infrastructure. And just so everybody knows, as an AWS partner and the types of things that we do, we can open tickets for customers on their behalf, right? Depends on their support package, but in this case, this is what we did. So we opened a ticket with AWS. AWS support team, quite honestly, did a really great job. They went through all their protocols. They went through, we'll call it all their playbooks to try and figure out where the underlying problem could be. But we got on calls with the customer. We were doing it asynchronously. And we really just weren't moving the needle, right? Customer wasn't getting their problem solved, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, they're hitting timeout issues. So customers actually literally couldn't even access their application, or it was dropping or something like that. But anyways, the customer's getting really frustrated and said, hey, we're going to start to think about requesting credits, because they felt that this was absolutely an underlying problem with the infrastructure, which didn't turn out to be the case. But we weren't going down a good path to start, right? Because the customer is really driven towards one particular outcome. So what we decided to do was, since we weren't making any traction, we decided to take a bit of a step back, right? Again, we took an approach to sit down with the customer, really talk about what they were doing with their architecture, what were they doing with their technical stack, so we could try and get at some answers, right? Because AWS legitimately could not find any problem with the infrastructure, right? Even though the customer insisted. So through this process, the DoiT folks, I think there's a couple engineers on this one, learned some really interesting things. Number one is, customer hadn't disclosed that they actually have multi-cloud setup. So they don't just use AWS, they use other clouds as well. They also have an on-premise database as well. That database is based somewhere on the west coast of the US, and all of this is connected via Direct Connect. So just for context for everyone, their users are global, right? They could be in EMEA, they could be in the United States, they could be in APAC, they could be anywhere. So this is kind of a really important thing to know about this particular case, given that there are worldwide clients, and they need low latency, high throughput, et cetera. The other thing that they found was there are load balancers, too, to route traffic, right? Pretty standard. And this introduces additional latency into the workload, probably 4 or 5 seconds, give or take, just depending on the request. So after we got all this context, which actually, hold on, the last piece is the types of queries that they were actually running was, think of it kind of like a vector search, right? Just they run a query, respond back with an answer type of thing. So once we learn more, all these different things that I mentioned, the DoiT architect actually decided to completely change how they were doing things. And he suggested long-lasting requests instead. Because he believed, based on their setup and their use case, what they were doing just wasn't form-fitted for API gateway and WebSockets, right? So in this case, they would just use REST, right? The REST protocol. So long-lasting requests in this case could be, and based on the diagram too, can be handled with polling, right? So we suggested SQS and helped them set this up. And there was the S3 component of this is there would be a check on the bucket where they would delete the object after the fact, right? And it turned out the app was actually struggling to scale as well. So polling was even better in this scenario for the customer. And while this slows down how their application performs, at least it actually works, right? Because, and one of the engineers actually wrote an article about this. If anyone wants to talk about it afterwards, happy to. Where the customer is literally just hitting the limits of physics, given their particular setup and what they were trying to accomplish. So given that, really their initial request was kind of unreasonable until we started to really dig in. And again, that's why it's so important to get all this different context, to use data to point you in the right direction. Otherwise, you're just never going to be able to solve the problem. So this is another example where some of you are probably wondering, what does this have to do with cost savings, right? Now, given the complexity of this one, on-premise database, we don't, we're a multi-cloud partner. We don't do a ton of work on-prem, and I wouldn't even have any data on that anyways. I looked. as well as we only work with them on AWS. We don't work with them on these other clouds. So it's pretty hard to pinpoint what exactly they save. It may not matter because, given that their application wasn't even working, there's probably some, more tangible business value that the customer didn't lose by changing this setup and making it more well-architected. So it's really tough for me to show you exactly what they saved, but it's a pretty interesting example of a customer being pretty dedicated to what they thought was the problem, only for us to kind of dig in and find out their architecture really wasn't as scalable as they thought it was. And they weren't using the right tools and the right services for the right application at hand. So the outcome is they got a more scalable architecture, no more failing requests, and customers are a lot happier, right? And they probably got some cost savings or business profitability value from this as well. So this next one, we have a developer platform provider based out of EMEA. And they came to DoiT to help them with some modernization efforts, particularly on regarding DynamoDB as well as S3. And the secondary aspect of what they wanted to accomplish was cost efficiency, right? If you're changing some of the aspects of your architecture, like sometimes it is a good idea to just focus on making it work versus making it cost effective up front. And migrations is kind of a typical example of that. A lot of companies do lift and shifts from on-premise to the cloud as an example. So again, very similar story as before. We used our tooling and our software to kind of dig in on areas where we thought they could be more efficient. We decided to only engage on DynamoDB in this particular case, and we left S3 to the side. But the interesting thing about Dynamo is DoiT actually has some internal code that we run as kind of like a playbook where we gather some information from their environment. So it requires some access into their AWS accounts, right? And it looks at things like read capacity units, write capacity units, the usage of their tables, CloudWatch metrics, et cetera. And the output of that is some analysis and some report, right? So again, I'm probably a broken record at this stage, but the initial phase is probably always gathering some data, right? And just for context for everyone, to talk a little bit about capacity modes and why this matters is in DynamoDB, you have two different modes, right? You have on-demand and you have provision mode. One is inherently more expensive than the other, obviously, on-demand being the expensive one, but obviously can scale with your needs. Provision mode is you have to go provision resources first, but typically makes the setup more cost-effective. But it can be challenging to figure out when to use it or how to blend those two models together, which is typically the best way to get the best price performance out of your DynamoDB databases. So long and short, the report that it generated is going to help us kind of directionally figure out where to go with all this, right? Now, the data was telling us they could make some changes in both the US as well as Europe, or in the EU. I think they're actually in Ireland in particular. And when we talked to the customer and they had some chats internally, they decided not to do anything in the US. The workloads were too unpredictable. More prod workloads were in the US. So again, this is just like a quick aside, but a good example of how the data told us we can go optimize in the US, but extra context told us that we shouldn't do that at all, right? So we decided to focus on the EU and Ireland. There's less risk there, and it's more predictable. So after probably like a couple of conversations with the customer on what's the right blend, using all this data, we agreed on implementing a potential solution. As you can see from the slide, again, the customer's able to reduce their costs by about $8K a month, right? Which, again, in context, is about 3% savings for this customer. Again, like they were initially engaging with us on modernization efforts, not necessarily cost efficiency. So through some of these processes, we're actually able to do both in tandem in some way, shape, or form, where the customer can go modernize as well as build a more lean, cost-efficient architecture. But again, long story short is the analysis told us to go in a certain direction, but really after we got more context and more business context, we decided to not go in certain directions because it just wasn't worth our time. So last one, and we'll probably have a little bit of extra time for questions, if anybody has any. But in this case, we have a travel agency and booking provider based out of EMEA. We have a lot of EMEA customers. As you can see, I think actually most of our AWS customers are in EMEA. But in this case, they're a really small company. They didn't have the staff to focus on cost optimization, right? Somewhat similar to this first case. So they're not even thinking about it at all. And this is pretty typical of probably a lot of companies, right? Especially startups or small, medium businesses where their priority is get out product, get out features, and we'll worry about the rest later, right? Which is a perfectly fine strategy, right? Like building products and features is probably more valuable activity than doing something like cost optimization, even though both are probably equally valuable in their own way. So again, they were really focused on keeping the lights on. That's really all they had the capacity to do, which is why they came to work with us, because they can use kind of our, call it elastic engineering. Again, I've been talking about the DoiT engineers a lot. That can come in and help them do something. So again, like through this typical process that we've talked about, and these screenshots, by the way, are all from our product, like reports that I built. We actually could have gone in many different directions. We could have looked at S3, we could have looked at Redshift, we could have looked at EC2, we could have talked about savings plan strategies, et cetera, right? But ultimately, what we decided to do was focus on Redis and Elasticache. We felt like they could get the most bang for their buck, starting there first, and it was a pretty egregious offender when it came to their bill in terms of how much money they were spending there. So in this particular case, they gave the DoiT engineers some read-only access into their AWS accounts, and he did an analysis across all of them to look at different instances that they were using, how they were being leveraged, again, this kind of right-sizing conversation, and he did it across test, dev, and prod, right? And we'll get back to right-sizing in a second. But when we talked to the customer about it, even though they could have saved significantly more if they had right-sized some of their production instances, we decided to stay away from that. The customer said, we can't touch that right now. It's not feasible at this stage, so let's just avoid it, right? We want to avoid any potential issues when it comes to those particular instance types. So again, the analysis initially told us there was, I think it was about 8 different instance types that they could have gone to right-sized. But the customer said, okay, well, we need to filter this down a little bit more. Again, like it's probably a typical right-sizing type of activity. We had them use different and smaller instance types, so they were better utilized and more cost-effective. And the customer ended up saving about almost $2,000 a month, which again, they're not a big customer, which is about 7.5-8% total cost reduction. Again, for context, the customer's probably spending about $25K a month or so, right? But it wasn't just right-sizing. There were a couple other activities that we did that the customer was unaware of. They had some nodes that were being heavily used from a read perspective, right? And they needed to distribute that load to a reader node, as an example, rather than on the primary. So what the DoiT engineer in this particular case did was they built out a whole proof of concept for the customer about how they could build this, how they could deploy it, and he handed that over to them, very similar to the Terraform example I gave before. So the customer could go deploy that in the appropriate environments so they could get better performance out of their database, which again is going to lead to more cost savings in the end. So this particular case is a pretty simple one, but again, it just goes to show, just like the last example, where it's just not always that straightforward. The data is going to tell you one thing, but you're probably going to have to go in other directions. The last thing I'd say here is that some of you are probably wondering, well, we just talked about right-sizing earlier and how that might be a bad idea, or at least like a less efficient one. To be fair, like again, right-sizing is a good idea. you can save on cost. But what we're doing with the customer now is we're thinking about re-architecting their whole platform, right? To think about using different instance types, not just on Elasticache, but on EC2, using more managed services. That's going to further reduce their costs over time. So that's the last customer example. I'm just going to, before we do questions, I'm going to quickly kind of wrap up and summarize for everybody. But as we all probably know this already, but hopefully I kind of hit home the point that running efficient cloud architectures, cloud technology, cloud stack can be a really challenging endeavor, right? Again, it's a consistent thing that you have to work out, almost like, going to the gym or exercising consistently. Like, you're not going to get good at it until you keep going at it, right? And again, like, what can seem efficient on the surface, many of these customers in these examples believe that they, had a really good team or had a really efficient architecture, but when we all kind of dug in together, it just really didn't turn out to be the case, right? And it's a very nuanced discussion, like I mentioned before, but that's what makes this such a challenging thing to deal with, because you may not even realize that it exists. So again, hopefully these real-life examples can kind of show you where you can hit some pitfalls, some things you could potentially avoid, maybe just even some tactical things that you can go implement yourself if you want to. But again, like, hopefully we've talked about some practices of kind of avoiding the illusion of efficiency. And the last thing I'd probably leave you with here is it's probably just always important to ask the right questions, right? Like, I think sometimes the inherent challenge of all this is typically it's probably end up going to be a data challenge. Like, there's obviously people in business contexts that I've talked about a lot. And in any analytics use case, it's all about asking the right questions. It's pretty typical if anybody's like in BI these days. You can get a question from an exec or a leader, and they're really just not asking the right one until you start to refine that a bit more. But anyways, hopefully this is helpful for everyone. Thanks so much for coming.